Georgie Porgy, pudding and pie, found loganberries in short supply. When Cruel ate the pie, he said, "Off with Georgie's pudding head." Chapter 14. Morning arrived and Elsbeth woke, as she frequently did, with the feeling of having been watched. She took a few moments just lying in the fetal position while trying to piece together the events of the previous day. Slowly she sat up, gave her stiff neck a good stretch, and jumped at the sight of Jill, peering at her through the bars of her cell with a wistful smile. "What are you doing? Have you been watching me sleep?" Elsbeth said. She quickly wiped the grit from her eyes and ran the back of her sleeve across her mouth for any remaining drool. "I'm sorry," said Jill. "I just couldn't help myself." She spoke in a whisper so as not to waken Jack and Georgie, who were still curled up, fast asleep on their own patches of dirt. "It is kind of weird," said Elsbeth. "I suppose it seems that way to you," said Jill. "It's just that we had a daughter once. We lost her." "Yes, I know," said Elsbeth, feeling it appropriate to stand up. Out of respect, perhaps? She wasn't sure. Though she may have been entirely unmoved by Bo Peep's tale of having lost her precious sheep, there was something about a mother speaking of her child in the past tense that could touch even the least accessible of hearts. "Dumpty told me all about it. I can't believe Cruel threw her down a well. Of all the horrible things, it must have been awful for you." "He came in the night," said Jill. By her faraway look, Elsbeth could tell that the scene now played vividly in Jill's mind. Cruel and his men. They snatched her away, and we could not stop them, no matter how hard we fought, kicked, and clawed. In the end, we failed. We failed to protect our own daughter. It was shameful. "But you did everything possible, right?" said Elsbeth, suddenly hit with a very strange and new emotion, an overwhelming desire to relieve the woman of her horrible pain. "You fought them as best you could. There's no shame in that. And you did try to get her back. You did go looking for her." "For any sign of her," said Jill. "For years we searched every inch of the kingdom. When we heard that she had been cast down a well, we set our sights on exploring each and every one, hundreds of them, until finally one night—" Jill stopped short and looked away quickly. The shaking of her head launched several large tears onto the dirt floor at Elsbeth's feet. Elsbeth moved closer to Jill, carefully stepping over the tears as though they were delicate living things. "What?" she whispered. "One night what?" Jill reached through the bars and took Elsbeth's hand while her eyes filled and overflowed. "One night, we found her." Without knowing why, Elsbeth pulled her hand away, and with mild reluctance, Jill released it. "You found her?" Elsbeth gasped. "You found your daughter's remains?" "Not her remains," said Jill, that tender smile returning once more. "We found her, alive and well." This new detail nearly knocked Elsbeth off her feet. "She's still alive? But Dumpty never told me." "That's because Dumpty doesn't know," said Jill. "Nor does anyone else. We mentioned only that we had found a passage out. The rest we kept secret, to protect you." Elsbeth's confusion could not have been more complete. "I don't understand. What does any of this have to do with me?" "The little girl who was thrown down the well," said Jill, "was you." "What?" said Elsbeth. She laughed at this, not because she found it funny, because she felt she ought to, considering the pure lunacy of it. "I think if someone had thrown me down a well, I would have remembered." "You are not even a year old. Let's just say we're all quite fortunate that you've always been very good at holding your breath, or Cruel might have succeeded in his plan. What he thought would be the end of you turned out to be a new beginning." Elsbeth looked beyond Jill to the sleeping heap on the ground, the one with the thinning hair, the ballooning belly, and the small space between his front teeth. Without realizing it, she began probing the gap in her own teeth with the point of her tongue. As ridiculous as it sounded, there was something both familiar and familial about these people. Looking at Jill's face, she noticed many of her own features gazing right back. "But that would make me your daughter," said Elsbeth, "and you my mother." "Yes," said Jill. And while she continued to smile warmly, Elsbeth slowly backed away. "No," she said, "you're confused, I'm afraid. Or crazy, or both." "Page 35, said Jill. "What?" "Of the book. If you need further proof, it's a very good likeness of you. In fact, it's how we were sure that we'd finally found you." "I don't want to look at that stupid book," sneered Elsbeth. "It proves nothing. Besides, I have parents, back home." "The Pules," said Jill, with a nod that looked like approval. "They've taken very good care of you, and for that we will always be grateful to them." Elsbeth was flooded with a desire to do something she hadn't in years. She wanted nothing more at that moment than to run to her mother and hug her tightly and without reservation. But then something that Jill had said moments earlier echoed in her mind. The bit about how she'd always been very good at holding her breath. The last thing Elsbeth had done before waking up in the middle of the strange forest was hold her breath until her living room had gone completely dark. It stood to reason, then, that by repeating the act, she might be transported back home, or at the very least to some other place far less dreadful. With nothing to lose, as Elsbeth saw it, she folded her arms across her chest, took in a very shallow breath, for the goal this time was not to prolong the process, but to pass out as quickly as possible, and stopped breathing. As before, sound was the first to go as her inner ears swelled and pounded. She didn't hear a word that Jill was saying, even though the woman must have been speaking quite loudly, because Jack woke abruptly. He sat up, staggered to his feet, and limped over to his wife. The two seemed to be pleading with her, talking over each other and motioning with their hands. Their voices would eventually wake Georgie, though Elsbeth took no notice of that. By then, the already poorly lit room was becoming darker still, and in a moment everything, Jack and Jill, the dirt floor and the iron bars, the dank air and the desperate gloom, disappeared, and once more Elsbeth found herself in the warmth and brightness of her own home. Ding dong dell, baby's in the well. Who threw her down? He who wears the crown. Did she survive? See page 35.